5 massive gorillas circle a dying man. His body is crushed, ribs cracking under the impossible pressure of a 20-foot python wrapped around his chest like a living vice. Blood trickles from his mouth as his vision blurs. This is it. This is how he dies. But then something extraordinary happens. Something that will challenge everything you think you know about the animal kingdom. The alpha gorilla locks eyes with the ranger, and in that moment of desperation, these wild beasts make a choice that defies every instinct of self-preservation. They attack the serpent. One gorilla grabs the python's massive head, risking his own life. Another yanks at the tail with tremendous force. 3 others work frantically to pry the coils apart, their massive hands fighting against muscles that could crush a car. The ranger feels the pressure release just enough to draw one precious breath, and that's when the most unbelievable part happens. One of the gorillas breaks away from the battle and does something that will make you question everything you thought you knew about animal intelligence. He runs into the jungle with a purpose so clear, so human-like, that it sends chills down your spine. Minutes later, that same gorilla returns, leading a rescue jeep driven by a female ranger who can barely comprehend what she's witnessing. 5 gorillas working together in perfect coordination to save a human life. This is not a fairy tale. This is not Hollywood fiction. This happened in the dense rainforests of Central Africa, and the implications of this rescue will forever change how we understand the bonds between species. But to understand how this miracle unfolded, how a routine patrol turned into a life-or-death battle that would unite the most unlikely allies, we need to go back to where it all began. Back to the morning when Ranger Marcus Dubois noticed something was terribly wrong in his sector of the Sangha Reserve. Before we dive into this incredible story, I need you to do something for me. In the comments below, tell me what country you're watching from. I'm genuinely curious about how far this story will travel, and it helps me create content that reaches people like you. Also, hit that subscribe button for Wind Echo Untold, because stories like this, real, raw, and absolutely mind-blowing, are what we live for. Trust me, after hearing this complete account, you'll understand why this channel exists. Marcus Dubois wasn't your typical park ranger. At 42, he had spent the last 18 years patrolling the Sangha Trinational, a massive protected area spanning 3 countries in the heart of the Congo Basin. While other men his age were settling into comfortable office jobs, Marcus lived in a world where every day brought new dangers and new wonders. His weathered hands told stories of countless encounters with Africa's most formidable wildlife. A scar across his left forearm from a territorial chimpanzee. Permanent calluses from years of machete work, clearing trails through vegetation so thick it seemed impenetrable. But it was his eyes that revealed the true depth of his experience. Alert, calculating, always reading the subtle signs that the forest whispered to those who knew how to listen. Marcus had chosen this life deliberately. After losing his father in a logging accident when he was 24, he decided that protecting these ancient forests was more than just a job. It was a calling. He lived alone in a modest cabin at the edge of the reserve, his only regular companions being the wildlife he was sworn to protect, and the handful of researchers who occasionally passed through his sector. But if you asked Marcus about his favorite part of the job, he would tell you about the gorillas. The western lowland gorillas that called Sector 7 their home had become like family to him. He knew each individual by sight, understood their hierarchies, their personalities, their routines. The alpha male, whom he had nicknamed Atlas for his impressive size and leadership, had grown comfortable enough with Marcus to allow him within 20 feet during feeding times. There was something profound about sharing space with these magnificent creatures. At over 400 pounds of pure muscle, Atlas could easily crush a human skull with his bare hands. Yet Marcus had watched him delicately pluck fruit for his offspring, seen him break up disputes among juveniles with the patience of a wise elder, witnessed acts of tenderness that reminded him that gorillas share 98% of their DNA with humans. This morning, however, something felt different. As Marcus prepared for his daily patrol, checking his equipment and reviewing his route through the sector's most challenging terrain, he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was trying to tell him something. After 18 years of listening to this wilderness, he had learned to trust these instincts. His backpack contained the usual essentials: first aid kit, satellite radio, GPS device, machete, emergency food supplies, and 2 cameras for documenting wildlife behavior. But today, almost as an afterthought, he had also packed his emergency tranquilizer gun, a tool he rarely carried and had only used twice in his entire career. Something was coming. Marcus could feel it in his bones, in the way the morning mist clung longer to the canopy, in the unusual silence that seemed to press against his eardrums. As he stepped into the green cathedral of the rainforest, beginning what he assumed would be another routine patrol, he had no idea that this day would test every survival skill he had learned, every relationship he had built, and ultimately redefine his understanding of what it means to be protected by the wild. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 weeks earlier, though Marcus didn't recognize it as a warning at the time. It started with behavioral changes in the gorilla family. Atlas, normally confident and territorial, began leading his group away from their traditional feeding grounds near the Mopaba River. The juveniles, usually playful and curious about Marcus's presence, became skittish and alert. Most concerning of all, the gorillas started making alarm calls, deep, rumbling vocalizations that Marcus had only heard during territorial disputes or when predators threatened the group. But there were no other gorilla families in the area, and the few predators capable of threatening an adult gorilla, leopards, and the occasional crocodile near the riverbank, typically avoided confrontations with Atlas's imposing group. Dr. Sarah Chen, a primatologist from the University of Edinburgh who had been studying the gorillas for her doctoral thesis, was the first to document the unusual behavior. During her observations, she noticed that the gorillas were consistently avoiding a specific area, a dense section of forest roughly 2 kilometers southeast of their normal territory. They won't even look in that direction, she told Marcus during one of their weekly check-ins. It's like there's something there that terrifies them. In 3 years of studying this family, I've never seen Atlas show fear. But Marcus, whatever is in that part of the forest has him genuinely spooked. Marcus initially dismissed the concern. Gorillas were naturally cautious creatures, and seasonal changes often affected their behavior. Maybe a large tree had fallen, altering the landscape in a way that made them uncomfortable. Maybe there was simply better fruit elsewhere, but as the days passed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The gorillas weren't just avoiding the area, they were actively warning against it. When younger members of the family wandered too close to the southeastern boundary, adults would quickly redirect them with urgent grunts and gentle but firm physical guidance. Then came the physical evidence. During a routine patrol 2 weeks ago, Marcus discovered deep gouges in the bark of several ironwood trees, marks too large and too high to have been made by any of the known animals in the area. The gouges were roughly 8 feet from the ground, carved in parallel lines that suggested massive claws. But even the largest male gorillas typically marked territory no higher than 6 feet. And their marks were distinctly different, broader, made by knuckles rather than claws. More disturbing were the tracks he found near a muddy section of the Mopaba River, drag marks in the soft earth, as wide as his body, leading from the water's edge into the dense undergrowth. Whatever had made these marks was massive, powerful, and unlike anything in his 18 years of experience. Marcus sent photos to wildlife biologists in Yaoundé, but the images were inconclusive. The tracks were partially obscured by rain, and the tree markings could have been caused by several different species, though none native to this region. Local communities had begun sharing stories too. Village elders spoke of a forest demon, a creature that moved through the trees like flowing water, silent until it struck. Hunters reported finding the remains of antelope and even small forest elephants, killed in ways that defied explanation. The wounds suggested constriction rather than typical predator. attacks, but it was old Mama Nkomo who provided the crucial detail that should have sent every alarm bell ringing in Marcus's head. Nyoka Mku, she whispered when Marcus visited her village to investigate the stories. The great serpent has returned to the Sangha. My grandmother told stories of such creatures, pythons so large they could swallow a man whole, so intelligent they could hunt the hunters. Marcus knew African rock pythons could grow to impressive sizes, 16, even 18 feet in exceptional cases. But the evidence he was finding suggested something far beyond the norm. And pythons were ambush predators, not typically territorial, in the way that seemed to be affecting the gorilla family. Still, he had protocols to follow. Rather than immediately escalating the situation, Marcus decided to conduct a systematic survey of the affected area. If there was indeed an unusually large snake in Sector 7, he needed to assess whether it posed a genuine threat to visitors, researchers, or the wildlife under his protection. That decision, to investigate personally rather than call for backup, would nearly cost him his life, but it would also lead to one of the most extraordinary displays of interspecies cooperation ever documented in the wild, challenging fundamental assumptions about animal behavior, intelligence, and the invisible bonds that connect all living things in the deep heart of Africa. Marcus began his systematic investigation at dawn on a Tuesday, the forest still shrouded in the ethereal mist that made the Congo Basin feel like another world entirely. His plan was methodical: establish a grid pattern covering the 2-square-kilometer area the gorillas were avoiding, document any unusual findings, and piece together a picture of what was causing the behavioral changes. The first day yielded subtle but disturbing evidence. Broken branches 20 feet above the ground snapped with tremendous force. Unusual scrape marks on rocks near stream beds. Most telling were the prey remains, bones picked completely clean, arranged in neat piles as if sorted by size. This wasn't typical python behavior. Pythons swallowed their prey whole, leaving behind only hair and sometimes small bone fragments in their droppings. Whatever was in these woods was different. Dr. Chen joined him on the second day of investigation, bringing her camera equipment and observational expertise. Together, they followed game trails that seemed to have been abandoned by their usual users. The forest here felt empty in a way that made both of them uncomfortable. "The silence is wrong," Chen observed, adjusting her telephoto lens to photograph some unusual markings on a fallen log. "In healthy rainforest, you should hear insects, birds, small mammals. This feels like a dead zone." That's when they found the first kill site. Hidden beneath a massive fallen kapok tree was the partially consumed carcass of a duiker, a small forest antelope. But the kill was wrong in every possible way. The animal hadn't been torn apart by teeth and claws, like typical predator kills. Instead, it appeared to have been systematically crushed, every major bone broken with surgical precision. Marcus photographed the scene from multiple angles, while Chen took measurements and notes. The kill was fresh, no more than 24 hours old based on decomposition rates in the humid forest environment. But there were no tracks around the body, no blood trail, no signs of struggle. "It's like the animal was killed somewhere else and placed here," Marcus muttered, examining the ground around the carcass. "But that doesn't make sense. What predator moves its kills after feeding?" The answer came sooner than either of them expected. On the third day of investigation, Marcus was working alone while Chen reviewed footage back at the research station. He had decided to focus on the southeastern corner of the affected area, following a game trail that seemed to lead deeper into the territory the gorillas were avoiding. The trail wound through increasingly dense vegetation, forcing Marcus to use his machete to clear passage. Massive buttress roots created cathedral-like spaces between the trees, and hanging vines formed natural curtains that limited visibility to just a few yards in any direction. It was in one of these shadowy clearings that Marcus first saw the track that would change everything. Pressed into the soft earth beside a seasonal stream was a single, perfect impression. At first glance, it resembled the track of a massive python, but the size was beyond anything in the scientific literature. The track was 18 inches wide, with clear impressions of scales and muscular undulation. Based on body proportions of known python species, this track belonged to a serpent at least 25 feet long and possibly much larger. Marcus knelt beside the track, his mind racing through the implications. A python of this size would be an apex predator, unlike anything currently documented in Central Africa. It would be capable of killing adult chimpanzees, small forest elephants, and yes, humans. But even as he processed this information, his peripheral vision caught movement in the shadows behind him. The attack came without warning. A section of what Marcus had taken for a massive fallen log suddenly exploded into motion. 26 feet of African rock python, thicker than a telephone pole, launched itself across the clearing with a speed that defied comprehension. Marcus had perhaps 2 seconds to register what was happening before 280 pounds of muscle and scales slammed into his lower body like a living battering. Rom, the impact drove him face first into the forest floor, his machete flying from his hand to land uselessly 6 feet away. Before he could even attempt to rise, he felt the first coils wrapping around his legs with inexorable strength. The python's body was warm against his skin, its scales smooth and alien as it began the process that had killed countless prey animals over its decades of life, constriction. Marcus had read about python attacks, had even seen the aftermath of smaller snakes taking down antelope. But experiencing it firsthand was a lesson in helplessness that no amount of training could have prepared him for. Each exhale allowed the coils to tighten slightly. Each attempt to struggle only seemed to encourage the serpent to apply more pressure as the coils worked their way up his torso, crushing his ribs and making each breath a monumental effort. Marcus realized with crystal clarity that he was going to die. His satellite radio was in his backpack, pinned beneath the snake's massive body. His machete might as well have been on the moon. No one knew exactly where he was, and Chen wouldn't begin to worry until he missed their evening check-in. But then he heard something that made his heart leap with desperate hope. Gorilla. Vocalizations, close, very close through the gathering haze of oxygen deprivation. Marcus could hear the distinctive calls of Atlas's family, but these weren't their normal foraging sounds or social communications. These were alarm calls, urgent and filled with distress. From his position on the ground, slowly being crushed to death, Marcus could see the gorilla family emerge from the dense vegetation at the edge of the clearing. Atlas led the group, 4 adult females, 2 juveniles, and 1 silverback subordinate male. They formed a loose semicircle around the python attack, their massive forms tense with conflict. Marcus could read their body language clearly, despite his deteriorating condition. They wanted to help. Every instinct that had evolved over millions of years of social cooperation was telling them to intervene on behalf of this human who had never threatened them, who had shared their territory with respect and understanding. But they were also terrified. African rock pythons were among the few predators capable of killing adult gorillas. While a full-grown silverback like Atlas might be able to fight off a python in ideal circumstances, the risk was enormous. And with juveniles in the group, the adults' primary responsibility was to protect their own offspring. Marcus watched through dimming vision as the gorillas began a complex behavioral display he had never witnessed before. Atlas approached to within 10 feet of the python, close enough that Marcus could see the individual silver hairs on his massive back. The alpha male dropped to his knuckles, pounded the ground twice, and issued a series of low, rumbling vocalizations. He was challenging the serpent. The python, completely focused on its prey, initially ignored the gorilla's display. But as Atlas moved closer, the snake's massive head lifted from Marcus's body and oriented toward this new threat. For a moment, predator and potential prey locked eyes in an ancient calculation of risk and reward. That's when something extraordinary happened. Rather than backing down in the face of the python's obvious power, Atlas began a series of complex vocalizations directed not at the snake, but at his family members. Marcus, despite his critical condition, recognized the sounds as coordinated communication, specific calls, directed at specific individuals. The response was immediate and unprecedented. 3 adult females began positioning themselves around the python at different angles. The subordinate male moved to Marcus's right, while Atlas approached from the left. They were coordinating. These gorillas were developing a strategy to fight an apex predator, not in defense of their own young, but to save a human being. What followed was the most extraordinary display of interspecies cooperation Marcus had ever witnessed, though he was increasingly unable to fully process what he was seeing due to oxygen deprivation. Atlas made the first move, grabbing the python's body approximately 6 feet behind its head and pulling with tremendous force. The serpent's immediate response was to tighten its coils around Marcus, causing him to gasp in agony as his ribs creaked under the pressure. But Atlas's attack had created an opening. One of the adult females, a 180-pound gorilla Marcus had nicknamed Diana, immediately grabbed the python's tail section and began pulling in the opposite direction. For a moment, the massive snake was stretched between 2 incredibly powerful forces. The python's response was swift and terrifying. Releasing some of its coils around Marcus, it swung its massive head toward Atlas, mouth open to reveal fangs capable of delivering a bite that could cripple even a silverback gorilla. That's when the 3rd gorilla joined the battle. The subordinate male, working with a timing that suggested either incredible luck or genuine strategic thinking, grabbed the python's head section just behind the skull, preventing it from striking Atlas. Now 3 gorillas were engaged in direct physical combat with a predator that could kill any one of them individually. Marcus felt the pressure around his chest decrease slightly as the python redistributed its coils to deal with multiple attackers. He managed to draw a full breath for the first time in several minutes, though his ribs screamed in protest, but the situation was far from resolved. The python, despite being attacked by multiple opponents, was still immensely powerful and was becoming increasingly aggressive. Its thrashing movements were putting all the gorillas at risk, and Marcus realized with growing horror that his rescue attempt might result in the death of creatures he had spent years protecting. That's when the most remarkable thing happened. Through the chaos of the battle, Marcus saw one of the adult females, a gorilla he called Luna, step back from the fight and look directly at him. Not at the python, not at the other gorillas, but at Marcus himself. For a moment that seemed to last forever, human and gorilla shared direct eye contact. And in that gaze, Marcus saw something that challenged every scientific understanding of animal cognition he had ever been taught. Luna was assessing the situation. She was thinking. Without any vocal communication that Marcus could detect, Luna suddenly broke away from the battle and ran toward the forest edge. But she wasn't fleeing. Her movement was purposeful, directed, and filled with what could only be described as intent. Atlas, still struggling with the python's massive coils, issued a series of sharp barks in Luna's direction. Not alarm calls or warnings, but what sounded like communications, instructions. Marcus's vision was beginning to fade again as the python, frustrated by its inability to dispatch the gorilla attackers, began applying crushing pressure once more. But through the haze of approaching unconsciousness, he was aware of Luna crashing through the forest with unmistakable purpose. She was going for help. The implications of this realization hit Marcus like a thunderbolt. If Luna was indeed seeking human assistance, if she understood that there were other humans who might be able to help in ways that gorillas could not, then these animals were demonstrating cognitive abilities that mainstream science had never documented. But consciousness was slipping away from Marcus as the battle continued around him. The last thing he remembered before darkness took him was the sight of Atlas, bloodied but still fighting, maintaining his grip on the python's body with a determination that spoke to bonds deeper than species, stronger than instinct. Dr. Sarah Chen was reviewing her morning footage when she heard the crashing in the forest outside the research station. Her first assumption was that a forest elephant was moving through the area. Only something that large could make such noise in the dense vegetation. But when she looked up from her laptop, she saw something that made her question her own sanity. Luna, one of the adult female gorillas from Atlas's family, was standing at the edge of the research camp clearing. The gorilla was agitated, pacing back and forth and making urgent vocalizations, while repeatedly looking back toward the forest and then toward Chen's position. In 3 years of studying these gorillas, Chen had never seen one of them approach the research station voluntarily. They maintained a respectful distance from human structures, acknowledging the invisible boundaries that Marcus had helped establish through years of patient habituation. But Luna's behavior was unmistakably purposeful. She would take several steps toward the forest, stop, look back at Chen, and vocalize with increasing urgency. When Chen didn't immediately respond, Luna actually approached closer to the research station, close enough that Chen could see the individual expression in her eyes. The gorilla was asking for help. Chen's scientific training warred with what her intuition was telling her. Gorillas didn't seek out human assistance. They didn't understand that humans could provide aid in situations beyond gorilla capabilities. The very concept suggested cognitive abilities that would require a fundamental revision of everything primatologists believed about great ape intelligence. But Luna's behavior was impossible to interpret any other way. Chen grabbed her radio to call Marcus, but got only static. She tried his satellite phone with the same result. A cold knot of fear began forming in her stomach as she realized that Marcus had been out of contact for over 4 hours, twice as long as his usual check-in interval. Luna, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly frantic. The gorilla began making physical gestures that seemed designed to communicate direction and urgency. She would move toward the forest, pause, and look back at Chen with an expression that seemed almost human in its desperation. The decision that changed everything came when Chen noticed something that made her blood run cold. Luna's hands and forearms were marked with what appeared to be blood, not her own based on her behavior, but enough to suggest that something violent was happening in the forest. Chen grabbed the emergency medical kit, her radio, and the tranquilizer gun that Marcus had insisted she keep at the research station. Following Luna into the forest felt like madness, but every instinct was screaming that Marcus was in mortal danger. What she discovered when Luna led her to the battle site would challenge everything she thought she knew about the natural world. The scene Chen encountered in that forest clearing was something that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life, while simultaneously filling her with wonder at the capacity for heroism that existed in the natural world. 4 gorillas were engaged in desperate combat with the largest python she had ever seen. Marcus lay partially visible beneath the serpent's massive coils, his face gray with oxygen deprivation, blood trickling from his mouth where the pressure had caused internal bleeding. But the gorillas weren't giving up. Atlas had maintained his grip on the python's body for over 30 minutes, his massive hands wrapped around scales and muscle with a determination that defied comprehension. 2 females were working to prevent the snake from applying fatal pressure to Marcus, while the subordinate male struggled to control the python's head and prevent it from striking the other gorillas. It was a battle that couldn't last much longer. The gorillas were tiring, and the python was becoming increasingly violent as its prey remained alive despite its best efforts. Chen raised the tranquilizer gun with shaking hands, trying to find a clear shot that wouldn't risk hitting Marcus or any of the gorillas. The dart needed to hit the python's torso, where it would be quickly absorbed into the bloodstream. But the constantly moving coils made targeting nearly impossible. That's when Atlas did something that demonstrated an understanding of human tools and intentions that stunned Chen into temporary paralysis. The massive silverback gorilla locked eyes with her across the clearing, assessed the tranquilizer gun in her hands, and then deliberately adjusted his grip on the python's body to expose a clear target area. He understood what she was trying to do. He was helping her aim. Chen's shot was perfect, the tranquilizer dart embedding itself in the python's muscular torso just behind Atlas's hands. But the snake's immediate response was a final, violent constriction that made Marcus scream, the first sound he had made in over an hour. For a terrifying moment, Chen thought the rescue had come too late. But the gorillas seemed to understand that this was their final opportunity. Working with a coordination that suggested either remarkable luck or genuine communication, all 4 gorillas simultaneously applied maximum force in different directions. Atlas and Diana pulled the python's body apart, while the other 2 females worked to uncoil the sections wrapped around Marcus. The tranquilizer was taking effect, but slowly. Python metabolism was different from mammalian systems, and the drug needed time to circulate through the massive snake's bloodstream, but gradually, incrementally, the crushing pressure around Marcus's body began to ease. When the coils finally loosened enough for Marcus to draw a full breath, the sound he made was part gasp, part sob, and part laugh. He was alive. Against all odds, surrounded by the most unlikely rescuers imaginable, he was alive. The gorillas maintained their grip on the python until it was completely unconscious, then carefully dragged the massive serpent away from Marcus's body. Atlas personally stood guard over the unconscious snake, while Chen administered first aid to Marcus, as if ensuring that the threat was completely neutralized before allowing himself to relax. Only when the medical helicopter arrived an hour later did the gorillas finally withdraw into the forest. Their job complete, the moment Marcus's eyes fluttered open in the forest clearing marked the beginning of the most extraordinary interspecies interaction ever documented in scientific literature. But the climax of this incredible story wasn't just about survival. It was about a moment of recognition that would fundamentally change how we understand the emotional and cognitive capabilities of our closest genetic relatives. As consciousness slowly returned to Marcus, his first sensation was the absence of crushing pressure around his chest. He could breathe. The realization hit him with such relief that tears began streaming down his dirt-stained face before he even fully understood where he was or what had happened. But as his vision cleared and his mind began processing his surroundings, Marcus found himself looking up into the face of Atlas, the massive silverback gorilla who had spent the better part of an hour fighting to save his life. The alpha male was positioned directly above Marcus, close enough that the ranger could see the individual silver hairs that gave silverbacks their name, close enough to smell the distinctive earthy scent of wild gorilla, close enough to see something in those dark, intelligent eyes that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. Atlas wasn't looking at Marcus the way a wild animal looks at a human. He wasn't displaying the wariness, the calculation, the constant assessment of threat that characterized most wildlife encounters. Instead, there was something that Marcus had never seen in 18 years of working with these creatures. There was concern. The massive gorilla's head tilted slightly as he studied Marcus's condition, and the ranger could swear he saw the same expression he had witnessed when Atlas checked on injured members of his own family. It was the look of a caregiver, a protector, someone who had invested deeply in the well-being of another. Marcus attempted to sit up, his ribs screaming in protest from the python's crushing embrace. Immediately, Atlas placed one massive hand on Marcus's shoulder, not restraining him, but steadying him, the same gesture the gorilla used with his own offspring when they were learning to navigate difficult terrain. The touch was gentle, despite Atlas's tremendous strength, and it carried a message that transcended species barriers. "You're safe now. We've got you." As Marcus's awareness expanded, he realized that all 4 gorillas who had participated in his rescue were positioned around him in a protective semicircle. Diana sat to his left, still bearing scratches from her battle with the python's thrashing coils. The subordinate male, whom Marcus called Bruno, maintained a watchful position near the unconscious serpent, ensuring the threat remained neutralized. The other adult female kept lookout toward the forest edge, alert for any additional dangers, but it was Luna's return that provided the most powerful moment of the entire encounter. The female gorilla, who had run for help, came crashing back through the forest vegetation, with Dr. Chen close behind her, carrying the emergency medical kit. Luna had successfully communicated the emergency to a human, led that human to the rescue site, and was now returning to check on the outcome of her unprecedented mission. When Luna saw Marcus sitting upright and breathing normally, her reaction was so fundamentally expressive of relief and joy that Chen stopped dead in her tracks, her camera forgotten in her hands. Luna issued a series of soft vocalizations while approaching Marcus directly, something she had never done in 3 years of Chen's observations. The female gorilla extended her hand toward Marcus, palm up, in what could only be interpreted as a gesture of greeting or comfort. Marcus, understanding the significance of this moment, reached out and briefly touched Luna's outstretched palm. The contact lasted perhaps 3 seconds. But in those seconds, 2 species acknowledged each other not as subject and observer, not as human and animal, but as individuals who had shared something profound. Luna had risked everything to save Marcus's life, and Marcus was acknowledging that debt in the only way possible. Dr. Chen's medical assessment quickly revealed the severity of Marcus's injuries. 3 cracked ribs, extensive bruising across his torso, and signs of internal bleeding that required immediate evacuation to proper medical facilities. Using her satellite phone, she called for emergency helicopter evacuation while the gorillas maintained their protective positions around the clearing. What happened during the 40-minute wait for the medical helicopter provided researchers with unprecedented documentation of gorilla emotional intelligence and social behavior, rather than returning to their normal activities or withdrawing into the forest as wild gorillas typically would after a stressful encounter. Atlas's family remained with Marcus throughout the entire waiting period. They didn't approach too closely, respecting the invisible boundaries that had been established over years of habituation, but they also didn't leave. Atlas positioned himself where he could see both Marcus and the unconscious python, maintaining guard over both the rescued human and the neutralized threat. The other gorillas took turns approaching to within a few feet of Marcus, each seeming to conduct their own assessment of his condition. Most remarkably, they appeared to be communicating about the situation. Chen's audio recordings from this period captured complex vocalizations between the gorillas that differed significantly from their normal social communications. The sounds were quieter, more varied, and seemed to involve specific responses from individual family members. It was as if they were debriefing the rescue, discussing Marcus's condition, or perhaps planning their next actions. When the emergency helicopter's rotors became audible in the distance, the gorilla's behavior shifted dramatically. Rather than fleeing from the unfamiliar sound, as would be typical, they moved closer together and closer to Marcus, as if forming a final protective barrier around him until human medical help could take over. The arrival of the medical team created a moment of tension that could have derailed the entire miraculous scene. The helicopter crew, focused on their emergency patient, initially failed to recognize that they were inserting themselves into an active wildlife encounter involving some of Africa's most powerful primates. Marcus, despite his injuries and medication, insisted on managing the transition carefully. Using hand signals and vocalizations he had learned over years of working with the gorillas, he communicated to Atlas that the approaching humans were there to help, not to threaten. The alpha male's response demonstrated an understanding of social dynamics that left Chen speechless. Atlas approached to within 6 feet of the medical stretcher, closer than he had ever come to unknown humans, and positioned himself where he could observe the medical procedures being performed on Marcus. He was supervising the handoff, ensuring that his rescued human was being properly cared for by his own species. Only when Marcus was securely strapped to the stretcher and being loaded into the helicopter did Atlas step back and signal to his family that their job was complete. But the moment that would define Marcus's relationship with these gorillas for the rest of his life came just as the helicopter was preparing to lift off. Atlas approached the aircraft one final time, close enough to make the medical crew nervous, close enough that the pilot prepared to abort takeoff if the massive gorilla showed any signs of aggression. Instead, Atlas did something that no wildlife biologist had ever documented in scientific literature. He placed his right hand over his heart, looked directly at Marcus through the helicopter's open door, and then extended that same hand toward the injured ranger in what could only be interpreted as a farewell gesture. Marcus, tears streaming down his face, managed to lift his own hand and mirror the gesture. Two species saying goodbye. As the helicopter disappeared over the forest canopy, carrying Marcus toward life-saving medical treatment, Atlas's family faced one final decision regarding the unconscious python that had nearly killed their human friend. The massive serpent was still alive, but deeply sedated from Chen's tranquilizer dart. In the wild, gorillas might simply have avoided the unconscious predator, allowing it to recover and return to its normal hunting patterns. But what the gorillas chose to do instead provided the final, extraordinary chapter of this rescue story. Working together with the same coordination they had displayed during the rescue, the four gorillas carefully dragged the python nearly half a mile away from the clearing, deep into a section of forest far from their normal territory and far from the areas Marcus typically patrolled. They weren't killing their enemy. Gorillas are not typically aggressive toward non-threatening animals, but they were ensuring that when the python regained consciousness, it would be far from both gorilla family territory and human patrol routes. It was a solution that protected everyone involved, demonstrating strategic thinking and consideration for long-term consequences that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal intelligence. Dr. Chen, who followed at a safe distance to document this behavior, watched as Atlas made one final gesture that would haunt her scientific understanding for years to come. After positioning the unconscious python in its new location, Atlas turned back toward the direction of the original clearing, raised himself to his full height, and pounded the ground 3 times with both fists, a display of dominance and warning that could be heard throughout the forest. The message was clear: this territory is protected. This will not happen again. Marcus spent 6 weeks recovering in the hospital in Yaoundé, the capital of Cameroon. His injuries were more severe than initially assessed: 4 cracked ribs, internal bleeding, severe muscle damage, and psychological trauma that would require months of counseling. But he was alive, and the medical team treating him struggled to understand how he had survived a constriction, attacked by a python of that size. The answer lay in the detailed footage Dr. Chen had captured during and after the rescue. When Chen reviewed her recordings, she realized she had documented something that would revolutionize primatology and our understanding of animal consciousness. The gorillas hadn't simply reacted to Marcus's distress. They had planned, coordinated, and executed a complex rescue operation that required understanding of human vulnerabilities, tool use, recognizing the tranquilizer gun's purpose, and abstract thinking about future consequences. The video footage was initially met with skepticism from the scientific community. Several prominent researchers suggested that Chen had anthropomorphized normal gorilla behavior, reading human motivations into instinctive animal responses. The coordination she described could be explained by simple pack hunting behaviors, they argued, even though gorillas aren't hunters and had never been observed engaging in coordinated attacks against predators. But when Marcus recovered enough to provide his first-hand account, corroborating every detail of Chen's observations and adding crucial context about the gorilla's behavior before and during the attack, the scientific community was forced to confront uncomfortable questions about animal consciousness, empathy, and intelligence. Dr. Jane Goodall, the world's most respected primatologist, personally reviewed the footage and Marcus's testimony. Her conclusion, published in the Journal of Primatology 6 months after the incident, fundamentally changed how the scientific community viewed great ape cognition. The behaviors documented in the Sangha Reserve rescue represent a quantum leap in our understanding of gorilla emotional and cognitive capabilities. The coordination, planning, and cross-species empathy demonstrated by Atlas's family suggest levels of consciousness that we have historically reserved for human beings alone. This is not simply tool use or problem solving, this is moral reasoning in action. The massive python that nearly killed Marcus became the subject of its own scientific investigation. When the tranquilizer wore off and the serpent disappeared deeper into the forest, wildlife biologists launched a comprehensive study to understand how such an enormous predator had remained undetected in the Sangha Reserve. Camera trap footage from the weeks following Marcus's rescue revealed that the python was indeed exceptional, measuring an estimated 28 feet in length and weighing over 300 pounds. It was likely the largest African rock python ever documented in the wild, explaining why it had been capable of behaviors far outside the normal range for the species. More importantly, the research team discovered that this particular python had been operating in the area for years, possibly decades. Analysis of local village reports, missing livestock, and unusual wildlife, deaths dating back over 20 years, suggested that this individual snake had grown to its massive size by systematically hunting larger and larger prey in an ever-expanding territory. The gorilla's behavioral changes now made perfect sense. Their acute senses had detected this apex predator long before humans recognized the threat, and their avoidance of the southeastern territory had been a survival strategy that likely saved multiple lives over the months preceding Marcus's encounter. Most remarkably, subsequent tracking of the python revealed that after its encounter with the gorillas, it had indeed moved its territory to the area where Atlas's family had relocated it. The massive snake seemed to have accepted the gorilla's territorial boundaries, avoiding both human patrol routes and gorilla family areas for the remainder of the study period. News of Marcus's rescue spread far beyond the scientific community. Local communities throughout Central Africa, many of whom had lived with stories of forest spirits and animal guardians for generations, felt vindicated in their traditional beliefs about the interconnectedness of forest life. Village elders who had been dismissed as superstitious for their stories of animal cooperation and communication suddenly found themselves consulted by researchers and wildlife management officials. Traditional knowledge that had been passed down through generations gained new respect as scientists realized that local communities had been observing and understanding complex animal behaviors long before Western science arrived in Africa. The village where Mama Nkomo lived experienced a particular surge of interest when her predictions about the great serpent proved accurate. Researchers who had initially dismissed her warnings as folklore returned to interview her extensively about traditional knowledge of python behavior and forest ecosystem dynamics. Most significantly, the story inspired a new approach to conservation in the region. Rather than viewing wildlife management as a purely scientific discipline, conservation organizations began incorporating traditional knowledge and community observations into their protection strategies. Marcus's rescue had demonstrated that the forest ecosystem was far more complex and interconnected than anyone had imagined. If gorillas could coordinate rescue operations and demonstrate moral reasoning, if pythons could modify their behavior based on interspecies negotiations, if the very fabric of the forest was woven together by relationships that transcended species boundaries, then conservation efforts needed to account for these invisible connections. 3 months after his rescue, Marcus returned to Sector 7 of the Sangha Reserve. His doctors had cleared him for light duty, though he would never again patrol alone in the deep forest. More importantly, he needed to see Atlas's family again, to understand how their relationship had been changed by their shared experience. Dr. Chen accompanied him on this return visit, both for safety reasons and to document what might be the final chapter of their extraordinary story. Neither of them knew what to expect from the gorillas, who had not been observed since the day of the rescue. They found the family at their traditional feeding ground near the Mopaba River, engaged in the normal social behaviors that had characterized Marcus's observations over years of study. For a moment it seemed as though nothing had changed, as though the rescue had been a dream or hallucination brought on by oxygen deprivation. But then Atlas noticed Marcus's presence. The massive silverback's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Rather than the cautious acknowledgement that had characterized their pre-rescue relationship, Atlas approached directly without hesitation to within arm's length of Marcus. The gorilla's examination was thorough and gentle. Atlas seemed to be assessing Marcus's recovery, checking for signs of injury or weakness with the same care he showed members of his own family. Only when he was satisfied that Marcus had fully healed did Atlas step back and resume his normal behavior. But the message was clear. Marcus was no longer just a tolerated human presence in their territory. He was family. Perhaps the most profound change was observed in Luna, the female gorilla who had run for help during Marcus's crisis. In the months following the rescue, Chen's research revealed that Luna had become something unprecedented in gorilla behavior studies, a bridge between species. Luna began approaching the research station regularly, not for food or attention, but apparently to check on human activities in her territory. She seemed to have appointed herself as a liaison between the gorilla family and the human researchers, monitoring both groups and intervening when interactions seemed potentially problematic. On several occasions, Luna actually guided visiting researchers away from areas where the family was engaged in sensitive activities, like mating or caring for injured individuals. She had learned to read human behavior and equipment, recognizing when researchers were attempting to get closer to the gorillas than the family was comfortable with. Most remarkably, Luna began displaying teaching behaviors directed toward humans. She would demonstrate proper protocols for moving through gorilla territory, show researchers which plants were safe to touch and which should be avoided, and even guide lost researchers back to established trails. Dr. Chen's documentation of Luna's behavior added crucial evidence to the growing body of research suggesting that great apes possess theory of mind, the ability to understand that other beings have thoughts, needs, and perspectives different from their own. Marcus's experience led to the development of new emergency protocols for wildlife researchers working in remote areas of Central Africa. The Sangha Protocol, as it became known, emphasized the importance of understanding local animal behavior patterns as an early warning system for environmental threats. More importantly, the protocol formally recognized that in extreme emergency situations, local wildlife might serve as allies rather than additional threats. Researchers were trained to recognize signs of animal assistance and to work cooperatively with wildlife during crisis situations rather than defaulting to human versus nature thinking. The tranquilizer gun that had saved Marcus's life became standard equipment for all researchers working in python habitat, and camera traps were deployed throughout sensitive areas to monitor for unusually large predators before they became threats to either human or animal populations. But perhaps the most significant change was psychological rather than procedural. The Sangha Reserve Rescue had demonstrated that the boundary between human and animal, between civilization and wilderness, was far more permeable than anyone had imagined. Scientific legacy 5 years after Marcus's rescue. The scientific papers analyzing the incident had been cited in over 300 research studies across multiple disciplines. Primatologists, cognitive scientists, conservation biologists, and even philosophers had found in this story evidence for theories about consciousness, cooperation, and the fundamental nature of intelligence itself. The rescue had provided crucial support for the growing movement to grant legal rights to great apes, based on evidence of their capacity for moral reasoning and complex social cooperation. Several countries in Africa had already passed legislation recognizing gorillas as non-human persons with rights to protection and habitat preservation. Educational programs throughout Africa and beyond used Marcus's story to teach children about the intelligence and emotional depth of wildlife, helping to build the next generation of conservationists with a deeper understanding of human-animal relationships. But for Marcus himself, the most important legacy was far more personal. Today, 8 years after his rescue, Marcus continues to work in Sector 7 of the Sangha Reserve. But his relationship with Atlas's family has evolved into something that exists beyond the traditional boundaries of human-wildlife interaction. Marcus is no longer just a researcher or protector of these gorillas. He is a member of their extended community, welcomed into their territory, not as an outsider to be tolerated, but as someone who belongs. When new members join the gorilla family through birth or migration, Atlas personally introduces them to Marcus, bringing infants close enough for the human to observe their development while ensuring they understand that this particular human is to be trusted and protected. The gorillas have also changed Marcus in ways that go far beyond his professional life. The ranger who once saw wildlife as subjects to be studied and protected now understands himself as part of an interconnected web of relationships that includes every living thing in the forest. They didn't just save my life, Marcus reflects during a recent interview. They saved my understanding of what life means. They showed me that intelligence, compassion, and heroism aren't uniquely human traits. They're the foundation of life itself, shared across species in ways we're only beginning to understand. The story of Marcus's rescue resonates far beyond the field of wildlife biology because it speaks to fundamental questions about consciousness, community, and the nature of heroism itself in a world increasingly divided by differences of culture, politics, and perspective. The sight of gorillas risking their lives to save a human being reminds us that the capacity for selfless action transcends not just human boundaries, but species boundaries as well. Atlas and his family demonstrated that true heroism isn't about being the strongest or the most powerful. It's about recognizing when someone needs help and choosing to act, regardless of the personal cost or risk involved. Their coordinated rescue operation showed us that intelligence and planning aren't uniquely human capabilities, but part of a broader spectrum of consciousness that we share with our closest genetic relatives. Most importantly, their willingness to risk everything for a member of another species challenges us to expand our own definition of community, of family, of who deserves our protection and care. Marcus's story has become a powerful tool in wildlife conservation efforts throughout Africa and beyond. The dramatic narrative of interspecies cooperation has captured public imagination in ways that scientific studies and conservation statistics never could. Funding for gorilla protection programs has increased by over 400% in the years since Marcus's rescue, with donors specifically citing the story as their motivation for supporting great ape conservation. The Atlas Fund, established in honor of the gorilla hero, has provided resources for anti-poaching efforts, habitat protection, and community education programs across Central Africa. Perhaps most importantly, the story has changed how local communities view gorillas and other wildlife. Rather than seeing wild animals as competitors for resources or threats to be avoided, many communities now understand themselves as part of a larger ecosystem where all species have roles to play in protecting one another. Villages throughout the Congo Basin have established community conservation programs inspired by the gorilla rescue, creating buffer zones around wildlife habitat and developing sustainable economic opportunities that depend on protecting rather than exploiting natural resources. Even 8 years later, scientists continue to study the implications of what happened in that forest clearing. New research into gorilla cognition, communication, and social behavior builds on the foundation established by Marcus's rescue. gradually revealing the full extent of great ape intelligence and emotional capacity. But some aspects of the story remain beautifully mysterious. How did Luna know that Dr. Chen could provide the specific help that the gorillas couldn't? How did the gorillas coordinate their rescue plan without observable communication? What internal dialogue led Atlas to risk his life for a human being? These questions may never be fully answered, and perhaps that's as it should be. The mystery preserves the magic, reminding us that no matter how much we learn about animal behavior and consciousness, there will always be depths to explore, connections to discover, wonders to experience. Marcus's rescue stands as proof that the natural world is far more complex, interconnected and miraculous than we dare to imagine. It challenges us to approach wildlife not as subjects to be studied or resources to be managed, but as fellow beings deserving of respect, understanding, and protection. This story doesn't end with Marcus's rescue or even with the ongoing scientific research it inspired. This story continues every time someone chooses to see wildlife as intelligent, feeling beings rather than objects for human use. It continues every time a conservation program receives funding from someone inspired by the courage of gorillas who risked everything to save a human life. It continues every time a child learns that animals are capable of heroism, compassion, and complex thought, and decides to dedicate their life to protecting rather than exploiting the natural world. And it continues right now with you. I want to know, what country are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments below, because I'm genuinely amazed by how far stories like this travel and how they connect people across the globe who care about wildlife and conservation. If this story moved you, if Atlas's courage, Luna's intelligence, and Marcus's dedication inspired you the way they inspire me, then subscribe to Wind Echo Untold. Hit that notification bell, because we're committed to bringing you more stories that reveal the hidden connections, the incredible intelligence, and the profound heroism that exists in the natural world. But more than that, share this story. Share it with someone who thinks animals are just dumb beasts. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that heroism comes in all forms. Share it with someone who needs to understand that we're all part of something bigger than ourselves, something that transcends species and connects every living thing on this planet. Because Marcus's story isn't just about one man rescued by gorillas in an African forest. It's about the possibility that exists when we recognize the intelligence, the compassion, and the courage that surrounds us in the natural world every single day. The gorillas chose to save Marcus, not because they had to, but because they could. Because it was right. Because in that moment, species boundaries dissolved, and all that remained was one group of conscious beings helping another. What will you choose to do with that lesson? What legacy will you create? The forest is still calling. Atlas's family is still there, still protecting their territory, still demonstrating every day that intelligence and compassion aren't human inventions. They're the foundation of life itself. Subscribe to Wind Echo Untold, and let's continue exploring these incredible stories together. Because the more we understand about the amazing creatures we share this planet with, the more we understand about ourselves. And the more we understand, the better we can protect the connections that make stories like Marcus's not just possible, but inevitable. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And thank you for being part of a community that believes animals deserve not just our protection, but our respect and admiration. Until next time, keep listening to the echoes of the wild. They have more stories to tell than you can imagine.